important article, Learning Representations in Bayesian Confidence Propagation Neural Networks. I've explained some of Lansner's papers. He is a great researcher in this area, and I like all of his articles, and he has great colleagues in KTH University. And this article is also important. Is spiking working memory module. If you want to know how working memory is implemented, can be modeled in your brain, it's a good idea. And so working memory is a key component in human memory and cognition. Computational models have been used to study the underlying neural mechanisms, but neglected the important role of short-term memory and long-term memory. For example, these are layer 2, layer 6, layer 1 to 6, layer 1 to 6, all of them, but there are different regions of your cerebral cortex, some of them for short-term memory, some of them for long-term memory. This stands for long-term memory. This stands for short-term memory. So you see how these interconnected networks of recurrent networks can represent almost all parts of your brain. So let's focus on this important article in 2003 by Anders. And these are positive samples. They're very related to this article as well. So the idea is that unsupervised learning of hierarchical representations has been one of the most vibrant research directions in deep learning during recent years. In this work, we studied biologically inspired unsupervised strategies in neural networks based on local Hebbian learning. We propose new mechanisms to extend the Bayesian confidence propagating neural network architecture. Well, I explained it in previous lectures, and you already know what it's about, but we just reviewed another paper, which is common. Around 70% of it is just common with what I've said in previous lectures, and demonstrate their capability of unsupervised learning of salient hidden representation when tested on MNIST datasets. So there is a big difference between biological neural nets versus these naive deep learning that we know in artificial intelligence. Most deep learning methods rely extensively on labeled samples for learning an entire hierarchy of representation. And second, deep learning methods use backpropagation, but we know in human brain, everything that we know is just Hebbian rules, and so everything is locally, which is more natural than backpropagation that backpropagates from very far regions to different layers. Thirdly, an important difference between current deep artificial neural networks and the brain concerns the abundance of recurrent connections in the latter. So it means that brain has lots of recurrent connections in comparison to a artificial. A typical cortical error receives on the order of 10% of synapses from lower structures, thalamus and those things, but all of this is just 10%. The other one is cortical neurons. And in contrast, deep learning networks rely predominantly on feed-forward connectivity. The surplus 90% connections are likely involved in associative memory, constraint satisfaction, top-down modulation, and selective attention. However, we will not consider those important aspects of cortical computation in this work. So we just write Bayesian confidence propagation neural networks, we have done it before. What is important that we will use X and Y for referring to hypercolumns in the input and output respectively. So X are hypercolumns in the input and Y are hypercolumns in the output. So if you just write this probability, it's a simple rule that you can write And so when the network is driven by input data, we can write the posterior probability like this. The posterior probability of target mini-columns in terms of source mini-columns. And now I is the indicator. This I here is just your indicator function that is just one if argument is true, zero otherwise. So the log posterior, this is important, that can be written in this short form. And since the posterior is linear in indicator function of data sample, I can be approximated by its expected value. We know this is the expected value of that. Except for P of x sub I, all the terms in the posterior are functions of the marginals, Px sub I and Px sub j, and we define the term's bias, beta. And this is the way just like previous lectures. So just like previous lectures, we just defined this, because this term is important, we call it hy sub j. And you know, this is just a softmax of that. And just like the previous lectures, we model P because we should model that. We know that the fixed point is that when these gets close to this one, any differential equation, any nonlinear differential equation. So your fixed point are in these areas, and you will see that you can analyze those locally, but the hard thing in nonlinear dynamical systems is that the global analysis is highly difficult, because you need to be very, very familiar with Markov chains. I have a playlist for Markov chain, and you will see why Markov chain is the best tool you can work with these nonlinear dynamical systems. I mean, globally. Locally, you can do many things like stable manifold, those local manifold, center manifold theorem, and everything. But what happens globally, because any perturbation can send you out of your region. And so this is a bias regulation that they described, and structural plasticity. So structural plasticity aims to find receptive fields for the hidden mini-columns from the input layer. We define a Boolean variable m sub ij denoting the connection from i's input hypercolumn to the j's hypercolumn as either active or silent. Each m sub ij is initiated randomly with probability p sub m. Once initialized, the total number of active incoming connections to each hidden hypercolumn is fixed, whereas the outgoing connections from a source hypercolumn can be changed. The mutational information between the i's hypercolumn and the j's hypercolumn is like this. So these are very important for analysis. And for example, when you want to do classification, for example, after layering the input, we freeze the weights, biases, and receptive fields, and treat hidden layer as input. Again, hidden becomes input, and you go to the next layer. Then we fix it, they freeze it, this becomes input, you go to the next layer. And it's very similar to that idea of deep belief propagation. And so they are not new, but they are formed in a different framework. We evaluate the bias regulation mechanism by measuring the accuracy while varying the relevant parameters. To quantitatively assess the effect of k-half on the marginals, we compute the marginal entropy of each hypercolumns. And basal ganglia refers to the group of subcortical nuclei within the brain responsible for motor control. as well as other roles such as motor learning, executive function, emotional behaviors, and play an important role in reward, reinforcement, addictive behaviors, and habit formation. And you see that your cortex has a connection with basal ganglia, whereas your striatum is here. One of the most important part of your basal ganglia is the striatum. And then through SNR, it comes back to spinal cord, and it comes back to the PMC thalamus, and it has connection with prefrontal cortex and different regions of your cortex. So basal ganglia decides on body movement, but cerebral cortex decides on body movement here, decides, but this is the basal ganglia that executes smooth movement. So this is cerebral cortex, all of these areas, each one for a different task. Basal ganglia is for your reinforcement learning or reward processing and those things, action generation. And so cerebral cortex, thalamus, is the gateway to all of your sensory, such as visual cortex, auditory cortex, and many of those things. Basal ganglia is for reinforcement learning. Cerebral cortex is the center of all processing. I mean, we don't have any center, just like a microservice architecture. Every module is doing it with a separation of concern principle in software architecture. But very complex behaviors occur when it goes from this one to this one. Just like Turing machine, just like any state machine, any automator, you see that it's a complex process. And we analyze it using a interconnection of dynamical systems, which itself is a dynamical systems, but it's very, very complex. But we can analyze it with our statistical tools. And this is the basal ganglia neurocircuitry. You see the cortex? The thalamus gives information in it going using glutamatergic neuromodulators, and you have different neuromodulators such as dopamine or any other thing. But the important thing is that striatum has a feedback connection with your cortex. And this is the cerebral cortex here. Thalamus is important here. What is important is a striatum. This is a striatum. If you have a section of your brain, you will see that you can see this like this. And this is an important picture from one of their papers. So also hippocampus, you think that hippocampus is just for pattern classification, pattern separation, pattern completion, and those things? No. It also gives feedback from striatum for reward. So reward is also important for that. So it may separate the patterns. After separation, the reward mechanism understands, can assign a reward, can evaluate that. Just any kind of actor-critic algorithm that you use for reinforcement learning can be implemented as this model, like this model. So now that striatum is connected to cortex. Cortex is related to hippocampus. Thalamus is the gateway, and also cerebellum. And this is the best picture that you can see, because everything is simplified. This is a big picture. You have cerebral cortex, you have hippocampus, you have striatum, and thalamus. If you don't know the other thing, it's not important, but at least you should know the relation between thalamus, striatum, hippocampus, and cerebral cortex, which is a big area. Each one has 6 layers, and in each layer we have hypercolumn. Inside hypercolumns we have mini columns. Inside mini columns you have lots of neurons, and in your brain you have 85 billion neurons. It's amazing. It's truly designed.